Yeah, so I'll try to keep it short, but it's like, yeah, it's actually collisions. So the sessions I had planned in the morning and the ones for the US in the afternoon kind of went collided. All of a sudden they were overlapping, or with no break were overlapping. It was like it's actually, yeah. There was only one week that would have happened as this week, that these things should have been kind of perfectly aligned, but they were not. So I didn't know that, and I didn't know. At least every year this happens. So every year there's this moment of, huh. But I heard that your government is voting for kind of not doing that again, keeping the same time.
Yeah, I don't know if they will.
Yeah.
It's kind of like talking about us changing to the metric system. I think it's something that people, like half the population would be happy with, but the other half would, firmly. That's pretty typical with everything in the United States right now.
Yeah.
Anyway,
same here.
Yeah, cool.
Um,
So we are live on YouTube, and I just want to review our kickoff stuff. So welcome to Wednesday Web Jam. We are a wonderful group of people who are clumsy innovators, hungry learners, design thinkers, cheeky co-creators, ignorant experimentalists, change makers, whatever, right? This is our community. You are our tribe. And our motto is failing forward, there is no other way. And today we're going to be failing forward a little bit as usual, but hopefully helping you guys understand some interesting stuff about this book that we read. We do ask that all of you be kind, be nice, and be empathetic to one another. That's kind of our shared values that we have in the team. And so I'm going to just welcome you to this book club. And it's a mighty book club, but a small and quiet book club for now. Steve and I have reviewed and read this book called The Wizard and the Prophet. And we're just going to kind of walk you through a little bit and also get your inputs on some of the concepts that we've been, that Steve and I have pulled out of the book. Before I get started, has anybody else here read this book? Okay, good. So Steve, we can pretty much say anything we want to, I think. So right, The Wizard and the Prophet. I would just say, yes, I picked this book. It's different than when Steve did his book. Steve picked the book, Parachuting Cats into Borneo, which we did last year. And this book came up on my screen it was Seth Godin's book of the year. And I thought, well, yeah, I like Seth Godin. He reads lots of books. If it's the book of the year, it must be really interesting. And I started reading it on my Kindle, which there it is. And I got into it and I thought, wow, this is really boring, but it wasn't boring. And I couldn't put it down. So I was kind of fascinated. Plus, the other thing that scared the crap out of me is I looked at the number of pages and it was going to take forever to get through. But we're going to take you through the high level here in the 1 hour that we have in book club. So what we're going to do, just as a preview, we're going to kick things off. I'm introducing the session right now. I'll give a quick overview of the book itself. Steve and I are both going to take, one of us will take the wizard and one of us will take the prophet and tell you a little about the two people that are behind this. And then we got a couple of activities. We want to tap into you guys' brains to help us dig into the subject that the wizard and the prophet, the book is all about. And then we can have some discussion. And of course, as you guys know, we have backstage and we can dig into this a little bit more deeply for the half an hour after this session. So we're going to dive in now, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about this book. So The Wizard and the Prophet talks about two different views of humanity's relationship to our environment, to the earth. And one is the wizardly view, And the wizard is a guy named Norman Borlaug, and he's a scientist and father of the Green Revolution. Both of these gentlemen are dead, but they were sort of children of the past century and set the course for essentially the environmental and eco movement around the world, at least from the Western perspective and probably primarily from the American perspective. But it is a global story. I will talk a little bit about that. He also won a Nobel Prize. I'll be talking about Norman. And then the other protagonist in this story is the prophet. And the prophet is Vogt's first name, Steve?
William.
William Vogt, right? And William Vogt also they were contemporaries. I think Vogt was a little bit older than Borlaug, but they're both around the same age, within about 5 years. So we're going to dig into and tell you a little bit about each of these different protagonists and who is the wizard and who is the prophet. And I just will say the book was, as I said, hard to put down. It was the thing that was amazing about it is it had so many facts and so much history in it, like lots and lots of history. It went into how Borlaug's parents met and where that whole backstory of this gentleman. Same thing with Vogt. But the storytelling was so good that you couldn't stop reading it. It was really engrossing. So if you have the time and you're interested, it's a good book to read. And the thing I love about it is it presents these different views that are not completely polar opposites, but it does not take a side. He doesn't take a side. He just is presenting these facts and letting the reader make the reader's mind up themselves. So what I want to do, and I know this may be a little bit boring, and you can follow along with the little dotted, the bouncing ball. I want to read a passage from the book just to kind of give you a feel for what the style of writing, but this also introduces the two schools of thought, the wizards and the prophets, or the prophetic view and the wizardly view. So here we go. Many of these measures apply to cities, but prophets believe the soft path also could apply to agriculture. So this is talking about agriculture specifically in California as an example to introduce the two different views. More than half of California farms use flood irrigation, covering their fields a few inches deep in water, as did the farmers of the ancient Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, right? Converting these to sprinklers would save huge amounts of water. More still could be conserved by simply not using irrigation when the soil is already moist. Incredibly, irrigation still continues to this day, even when it's raining outside. It's kind of crazy, right? Further savings could be made by adjusting what farmers grow, as Israel has done with cotton. Most of the almonds in the United States, for example, are grown by about 400 large operations in the San Joaquin Valley, which uses about 10% of the state's water supply. And the state remains the nation's biggest producer of alfalfa used for feeding cattle. Most of that feed is sent to other states that could grow their own alfalfa, and some is actually exported across the Pacific. Meanwhile, more water is used to grow alfalfa than is consumed by all households in California, and so on, right? So this is introducing how kind of dumb things are in some ways about how wasteful we can be. So the dispute in California will be echoed in different ways across the globe. The hard path creates a universally wizardly solutions that do not depend on local conditions or knowledge, right? So this is not adapting the crops to their local environment. It's the hard path, it's the wizardly path. It leads quite naturally to broad fields of waving grain, visions of concentrated productivity. Societies that adopt the soft path will lead toward networks of smaller farms with drip irrigation and multiple crops, the inhabited network spaces preferred by prophets. So prophets have the soft path, wizards have the hard path. One values a kind of liberty, the other a kind of community. One sees nature instrumentally as a set of raw materials freely available for use. The other believes each ecosystem has an inner integrity and meaning that should be preserved, even if it constrains human actions, right? The choices lead to radically different pictures of how we live or how to live. What looks like a dispute over practical matters is an argument of the heart. And to me, that last bit goes to the heart of the book and the heart of the difference between wizards and prophets, right? So it's kind of like man over nature versus man in nature. So the book goes into presenting the two protagonists, which Steve and I are both going to dig into a little bit here, but it also talks about, after introducing those two people and their backgrounds, four sort of principal elements of our, I would say, our survival here on Earth. So it's about earth, water, fire, and air. And earth is all about the food that we eat, right? And how we grow the food. You're going to see that come up over and over again in this story, because both of these guys were involved in various different aspects of food. The other one is about the water, the fresh water in particular, that we need to survive as humans. And what's really interesting, there's a diagram in the book. All of the water on the world, and this is sort of meant to be to scale, all of the water, including the oceans, is in comparison to the size of the Earth, is like that little drop. So it's a spherical drop that's doesn't look like it's all that much, actually, right? And that little tiny one that you can't actually even see, that's all of the fresh water in our lakes and rivers. The rest of the Earth's fresh water, actually, so this one, there's all of the water, there's the fresh water, and you can't even see the water that we can access. The rest of the water is underneath the ground that we can't access. We can't even drill to it, it's too far down, right? So there's not a lot of water. Anyway, I like that picture. Then they talk about fire, which is the energy that we produce, right? And there's a lot of stuff going on about energy, stories about how the first oil wells, they weren't actually wells, they were just like oil in Pennsylvania, and at least this is how it happened in the United States. And they would just dig it up. They would go just a few feet below the ground, and they dig it up and put it in barrels, and they'd put the barrels in streams to transport them down the stream. And of course, the barrels, actually they built a dam, and then they would bust the dam and let the barrels go down. And of course, many barrels would bust, and some people would actually scrape the oil off of the water. And there was this big boom. That was one of the stories they talked about. Major, just amazing storytelling. This is one of the stories they talk about, some of the original technology back in the 1800s by one of the French scientists, which is a precursor to the heat solar energy. And then this is one of the world's largest solar farms in Gujarat in India. You can see, how big it is. It's amazing. Anyway, and then air. Air is all about climate change. It's about the warming of the earth and about the contributing factors of the air that we breathe, right? So these are all things that we need as humans to survive: food, fresh water, energy, and climate, right? Air. So it's quite an interesting kind of overview, and he, in the book, sort of covers all of those elements one by one in great depth. So if you want to know about that, read the book. It's just amazing. Steve, I'm going to pass it over to you. Would you like me to scroll for you, or do you want to have control?
I will take control if that's okay.
Sure, go for it.
All right. Here we go. All right. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
All right. So the prophet that the book talks about is this fellow named William Vogt. He was born in 1902, so turn of the century, Long Island, New York. For those of you who don't know Long Island, it starts right off of Manhattan and stretches pretty far out into the ocean and kind of north to the northeast. And actually, it was an incredibly fertile area with a lot of farms on it during the turn of the century before it became completely suburbanized, or at least most of it was. So he grew up in what was then a pretty natural area with meadows and coastline, birds, forests, things like that. He was a pretty reclusive kid, and as Marc talks about his history, he came from sort of a scandal affected family. His father left them for another woman, and his mother had to go and live with her mother. So he spent a lot of time alone, a lot of time wandering out in nature. He was not a formally trained biologist or scientist in any way, but he was a writer. When he went to college, he came out of college majoring in drama and became a drama critic. And this, I think what's interesting about these stories is how people's lives can take them down different paths. Here he was a drama critic in New York City in the 1920s, covering shows on Broadway. And then 1929 comes along and the market crashes. Well, nobody has money to go out to plays anymore. So the entire entertainment business in New York collapses and he doesn't have a job anymore. And incidentally, his wife at the time had come to New York City to be an actress on Broadway. And so her opportunity shut down as well. Luckily, he was a good enough writer, and he had friends who were involved in conservation and in science. And his life is a series of kind of missed opportunities and then new windows opening up. He would lose a job, and then a friend of his would find him another job. So he became a writer for the Audubon Society, which is one of the earlier conservation groups in the U.S. He got fired from that job, and part of the reason was because he was one of the environmentalists who talked about impending disaster. From an early age, he had seen how development had started to change the places where he grew up, and he saw how it impacted wildlife and wild places. So he was constantly talking about all the problems that humans were causing on the earth. And one of the big ones back in the 20s and the 30s was mosquito control. In America, we used to have malaria too. And we spent a lot of money and time and effort digging ditches in coastal wetlands and draining those wetlands to make sure there would be no more mosquitoes. And then also, of course, spraying them with pesticide. And he saw the decline in bird populations that came along with the mosquito control. So he was speaking out against mosquito control, and he was using his platform writing for the Audubon Society to do that. And some of the people at the top of the Audubon Society, who were at sometimes wealthy industrialists, didn't like his sort of anti-capitalist, anti-development tone. So that kind of covers a lot of his youth. But then a critical thing happens. He gets fired from the Audubon Society magazine, where he's a writer, and he ends up getting a job in all places on these islands in Peru. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Chincha Islands off of Peru, Danny or Ximena. Are you guys familiar with that?
The Incas, yes.
The Chincha?
It's a culture.
No, well, it's a Chincha, Chinca.
I think Beatrice says she knows of the island.
Yeah, it's not Inca, but Chincha. And this little 3 islands off Peru. And this is where I want to show you. So here's William Vogt as an older man. This is a picture of what was on the Chincha Islands back at the turn of the century. Millions, I mean, hundreds of thousands maybe is more accurate, of a cormorant. They called it the guano cormorant. What was this bird known for to humans? Producing guano, tons and tons of guano. And they discovered in the 1800s that guano, if you spread guano on farm fields, you would increase the yield of crops. They didn't know exactly why at that time, but they knew it worked. So Peru made a lot of money by exporting guano. They gave concessions to big companies who would come to the Chinca Islands and harvest the guano. So there's a picture of some of the guaneye cormorants nesting on the island. You get to see what they look like. And then just to give you a sense of what guano mining looks like, I mean, that is actually a pile of guano that these men are standing next to mining. I mean, they had major kind of industrial operations to get this guano off the island into boats and then ship it to North America or other places around the world to use as fertilizer. And the thing that Vogt was asked to do was to increase the increment of excrement, is what he said. The guaneye populations were dwindling. The number of cormorants on the island was going down, and the companies that were exporting the guano were worried that if the bird populations dwindled, they wouldn't have as much guano to export. So he lived on these islands for a couple of years studying the birds. And what he discovered was really, and it's kind of this environmentalist philosophy, you really weren't going to be able to do anything to increase the numbers. The numbers would fluctuate from time to time. And some of that had to do with the El Nino current. You've probably all heard of the El Nino current and how that changes weather patterns. It changes the Humboldt current off the western coast of South America. And when that changes, the anchovy, the little fish that, the cormorants feed off of, their migration patterns change, which means the cormorants have to go further out away from the islands to find food. And they often abandon their chicks in the nests when they have to do this, when El Nino comes. And it looks awful. It looks like complete devastation. There's dead baby birds everywhere, and it freaked out the people who were exporting guano. And when Vogt studied it, and he got in planes and he traveled all up and down the coast of Peru looking for where the guaneye cormorants went. And he would find them in different places, and he decided, look, there's not a lot we can do to change these climactic patterns. They will shift back and you will get the birds coming back, but you can't worry about kind of the annual fluctuation in the birds. In a sense, saying, look, there's a larger system at play here. You have to respect the system. And if anything, if you try to meddle too much with the population and unnaturally enhance their numbers, it's going to cause a problem and the system might collapse because the system has a carrying capacity, right? And you can't push beyond that carrying capacity. So Vogt did a lot of studies on things like birds and populations. He ended up authoring a book called The Road to Survival. And in a way, this was like kind of an early philosophical treatise on environmentalism. And you might call it like apocalyptic environmentalism, which the author, by the way, talks about being kind of the major ideology of the 20th century, or at least lasting ideology of the 20th century. This idea that the earth has to be taken care of, essentially, we need nature, but nature doesn't need us. And so if we don't respect the system in which we live, the ecosystems and the biomes, we're going to cause them to malfunction, and then we won't be able to live. It damages nature, but it also damages us. So he was really the early philosopher, if you will, or one of the early philosophers of environmentalism. Really, if you boil it down to it, it's about respecting Earth's limits, right? You should not overtax the Earth systems. You have to learn how to work within them. People talk about affluence being our greatest achievement, and especially if you think about this industrial age. I mean, it's early 1900s to mid 1900s. We've gone through industrialism, if you will. I mean, we're still in an industrial age. War has become mechanized. There are great swings. Well, population is increasing, even though we learn how to kill millions of people during World War I and World War II. But Vogt sees affluence as our greatest problem, not our greatest achievement. And he says that just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do it. Just because we can create all these material goods doesn't mean we should do that. And I just want to, part of this, and where Marc and I are going to go with this, is talking about systems and ecosystems. A lot of what you're going to hear about from Marc is about the, how Norm Borlaug meddled, or you should say, engineered plant genetics to create crops that could improve the well-being for people. And what he did was, if you can see this image here, was he learned how to make sure that plants could resist. I don't want to take away too much of Marc's thunder, but plants could resist disease, and that you could meddle with the nutrients also in the soil. And Vogt says, look, there's a carrying capacity here. This is a system that we have to respect, as I said, and it's not good to just increase yields from crops and not worry about what happens to the soil and what happens to the earth. There's a lot of bad side effects that happen when you try to start engineering different parts of nature, kind of meddling with components of nature instead of looking at as a larger system. So that is the, kind of the overall view of, in short, obviously, of William Vogt. He died in his 60s. He got a lot of recognition for the road to survival. Even though, like you said, he wasn't a classically trained scientist, he got a lot of respect within the scientific community. But there were a lot of people who opposed his views and said, he's too doctrinaire, he's too anti-capitalist, he's more of a philosopher and not as much a scientist. He doesn't understand scientific processes. We can deal with growth. We can deal with ways to improve the earth and manage nature. Don't worry about people like Vogt. All right. Does anybody have any, I should just stop now. Does anybody have any questions about Vogt? I can answer. Nope. Okay.
Hello, Steve.
Okay.
What
Thanks,
was that?
Steve.
Okay.
All good?
Marc. Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So I am not going to probably have as much great detail as Steve had, but I'll tell you a little bit about Norman Borlaug. He's the wizard. He's the sort of father of the wizard movement. Born in 1914, he lived until 2009. As I mentioned, he was a Nobel Prize winner, very much the father of the green movement, and that was really referring to the amazing work that he did, essentially feeding the world, right? And that was a major achievement. Kind of going back a little bit to when, and just kind of to refresh, I think it's fair to say to some degree that wizards are about how man can be the master of natural resources, right? And the difference between the wizards and the prophets is that the prophets, their perspective is we need to live with nature, right? And so that's a really kind of a very different view. And also, I mean, Borlaug really believed that anything is possible through science and through like just grit and determination. That was one thing that it kind of started from when he was a young child. He grew up in Minnesota, in the plains of the United States, the northern plains, very cold, sort of. I think it was Minnesota, somewhere anywhere. Yeah, Iowa, I don't know. Cold place. And when he was 8, his family bought this house off of Sears and Roebuck catalog. They bought the house in a catalog. It was $964 for the house. And, that's kind of how the family is from, I think, the Czech Republic, or sorry?
I think it was Norwegian.
No, well, it's Norwegian. That's right. And there was two anyway, there were two sides of the family, but they were Norwegian, exactly. When he grew up, they talk about how in that day and age, children on a farm worked from before the sun came up until after the sun went down. His grandfather said, you have to get an education because otherwise you're not going to better yourself. And he actually went away to school. He was a baseball star in his high school in the town he lived in, but ended up getting a scholarship to a university as a wrestler. And he was kind of concerned early on about leaving the family. He was the oldest boy in the family. But the year after he left, his family bought a tractor, which changed everything. And the thing is, back then, before vehicles and automation, right, like tractors and cars, animals were the way that they would sow their crops and run their farms. And when they got a tractor, they were able to about half of the farm's production went to creating food for the animals that worked on the farm. So they got so much more production by just having an automated way of doing that. So that was a really impactful lesson that he learned as a child. And then, of course, he went away to school. He had some really formative experiences with some of his teachers. He built this relationship with a really grumpy professor who was super brilliant and taught him all about how to I don't know what the term is, Steve, but where you change the characteristics of crops. What is that called? I should know it.
Plant breeding.
Plant breeding. Thank you very much. And so then he fast forward, he gets a job through this professor who, called him up. He actually went to work for DuPont at one point during the war. And because he couldn't get into the army, he went to work because he was too smart. Apparently, they needed him to work on science stuff. And so he worked on all kinds of things with DuPont. But then he got called out of that by this professor who actually the president at the time, Roosevelt, I think it was his vice president, was really big into agriculture and knew about this guy and they sent him to Mexico. And the idea was that the big thing that this professor guy that he was working for, the grumpy guy, was studying was this thing called crop rust, which is a sort of a fungus that grows on crops and takes out, just entire swaths of crops. That led him to go to Mexico because there was this, oddly enough, this highway of spores that would be blown across the whole continent, and it started in Mexico. So his thought was, I'm going to go to Mexico. I'm going to help feed people who are at that time were subsistence farmers, and it had very bad quality of life. He had visited Mexico in terms, not quality of life, but ability to feed themselves, but also solve the problem that actually affected where he was from, because there's this highway of spores that would go up into the atmosphere and actually contaminate crops all the way across the United States. So he spent the better part of like 5 years, I can't remember how long, don't worry about it. It was a long, long time, breeding these crops like meticulously, and there was no automation. It was just people taking seeds and getting each one of these little heads of the seeds and putting them in bags so that they don't get contaminated. All kinds of it's amazingly described. But he was super successful eventually after failing over and over and over again. Does that sound familiar? And so he went to he did this study, lived in Mexico for a long, long time, and figured out, like, revolutionized this whole science of plant breeding. And for that, he won the Nobel Prize. Later, he did the same thing in Asia, in Pakistan in particular, to help them improve their rice crops. So it was like that was pretty much his thing, right? Is to work on this rust-resistant wheat hybrid in Mexico. But he was really driven as like morally toward using science to help people come out of their desperation, basically. And just another quick quote I'd like to read. So the wizard's way, his success would show, at least to wizards, that science and technology properly applied could allow humankind to produce its way into a prosperous future. To the question of how to survive, his work said, be smart, make more, share with everyone else. It said, we can build a world of gleaming riches for all. And the concomitants of this world, the giant installations, the whirring machinery in the garden, the glare of artificial light in the night sky, are all to be embraced, not to be feared. So yeah, he won the Nobel Prize. He was a brilliant man, lauded in his field. And the one thing Steve and I talked about is the wizards and the prophets are not really at polar opposites. In fact, there's a lot of overlap between what they do and the way they believe. And one of the things we talked about preparing for this session was how nuclear energy, you would think, and that's a really good example, because that's gone from being something that people frowned upon to now, especially if you think about what's going on in Ukraine and the energy dependency of Europe on Russia. After Fukushima, the Germans basically closed down all of their nuclear power, and some other countries did the same. And now Germany is incredibly dependent on Russia for energy. I think 40% of Europe's energy comes from gas from Russia. So that's a geopolitical thing, but it's also an environmental thing. Nuclear is kind of this weird thing that is not carbon free, but low carbon. But it has this these really scary side effects that we've seen with the various different disasters, Chernobyl, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, that have that put it in somewhere in between the wizards and the prophets, right? Like, and another point is that wizards are really a lot about centralization. So centralized energy sources, centralized energy production, big power plants, distribution, whereas prophets on the energy side are more about having distributed energy generation, right? So that talks to solar and wind and hydro, hydro is really not easily expandable, but they're all local type of energy generation. So again, I don't think one is right versus the other, because we know that our energy mix needs to be a mix. But that's just an example of how there's this, it's not a complete dichotomy, but there's these different ways of looking at the problem. So actually, Steve, I suggest because we're getting close to the top of the hour. We can do a couple of activities. We don't have to do a couple of activities, but we can. But I see that, Jimena, you have a question. We can open it up for a couple of questions, and then if we have some time, we can go into one of these activities.
Yeah, I think I read these reviews on the book, and I think it's more about like what you share right now, that, for example, it takes a wizard to have built these panels, right? And because there's like some magic in it to
exactly
have been able to transform the solar energy to now to a different thing. But then the profit side is that when you make it available to communities and people by people, so you have both at the end. You have these, like, the prophet and the wizard, which coexist in the end. Yeah. So it was like a good thing that you don't have to be one or the other, but in the end, how both ways come together for people, I guess to make everyone's life better in the end. And just also read on the challenge of, well, if middle class in the end, they also want, or if there's an increase on that, they want a good life as well. So how are we going to sustain that through times?
Yeah, and I think, yeah, exactly. And that was the sort of, not debate, but discussion that Steve and I had as we were talking about the book as well, is that it's not an either or. I think it's got to be a little bit of both. Yeah. Any other questions or comments from y'all? our small little group, our little fun family here?
I have, oh yeah. Well, no comments actually. So I'm really enjoying this. You could do this. Can you do this every night? Because, well,
Every
no.
Wednesday?
Well, yeah, I have dyslexia, so I like audio books, and Blink is, the short version. This is like in between, which is awesome, and I love the pictures of it. So yeah, I was like, I want to know more.
Yeah,
So
audiobook, Arna.
Yeah.
I mean, understand dyslexia is a difficult for consuming the book, but it's definitely Steve, I think, did the audio.
Yeah, I have an audio book on Audible, and it's good.
Okay.
Go ahead, Martin. Sorry.
No, I did not. Go ahead. I have one.
Well, I have a question to pose to you all, and to maybe get the discussion going. And this is part of what Marc and I were talking about is, in essence, Borlaug's a designer, right? He's designing a future for agriculture. He tried to design. He did design plants that could yield more crops, so that people could, there'd be less starvation, and actually it also allows populations to expand. The reason it's interesting, he won the Nobel Prize, but he didn't win a Nobel Prize for science. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, which I think is really interesting, right? They talk about how, the fact is that he ameliorated hunger for a good chunk of the world, and his plants now, the plants that came out of the work he did, are grown all over the world. There's rice too, the rice varieties that were grown using his methods to breed them, were introduced in Asia. And now the Gates found it's really interesting. At the time when Norm Borlaug was doing his work in Mexico, just outside Mexico City, it was the Rockefeller Foundation funding this. Mm-hmm. And then the Ford Foundation ended up being the foundation with the big money, and it became Ford and Rockefeller together working in Asia. Now it's the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation is funding all this work to try to basically tweak photosynthesis in some of these agricultural plants. One of the things you find out in the book is that photosynthesis as a process is actually not highly efficient. There's like some problems with it. And they've always been trying to play with ways to tweak photosynthesis so that it's more efficient and you can get more growth out of plants. Mm-hmm. Does anybody here have a lawn like that they have to mow? Does anybody here a gardener who has to weed? One of the interesting things I found out, and I should know this because I did go to school for some natural resource stuff, is the weeds that we hate in our lawn, like crabgrass here in America, they use a different type of photosynthesis called C4, and they're just better at harnessing the sun's light to grow faster, and they need less nutrient dense soil. So they outcompete the things that we want to grow, like, lovely grass. Mm-hmm. But where I'm going with this is, what are the ethical obligations of the designer? If we're designing, I've never designed anything that took off and everybody wanted to buy, like an iPhone or a car or, designed wheat. Think about this as, if we are designers and we're trying to design a better world, but also better products and services, what obligation do we have to think about the larger system and the limits of those systems when we're designing?
So that's a great transition, Steve, into this little tiny quick activity. I'm putting a link into a mural board, and if you all will jump in there, just to kind of like, we've got about 10 more minutes, and we'll maybe not even to close up. Let's take a few minutes to brainstorm some different kinds of solutions or interventions that we can do, that man does for in our world, and ones that are more prophetic, so more like the vote, prophets, and the stuff that's more wizardly, right? And the things that are more like the Norman Borlaug stuff, right? So just take a minute to add some ideas. It doesn't have to be solutions or interventions, this is a moment for you to just kind of capture some thoughts. I'd love to do this, and then we can have a quick wrap up discussion.
Mark, is this the activity at the bottom then?
Yeah, the activity at the bottom.
Because I think the link might have brought you to the top. You want to go down to this kind of timeline where most prophetic is on the left and most wizardly is on the right.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Yeah, I'll summon everybody to me, and that should bring everybody down here. So just type in some thoughts. We'll give you 4 minutes on the timer, and then we can do a quick debrief. Yeah, organic farming, definitely on the prophetic side. I see that. Yeah. Climate awareness, societal education level. Yeah. Ecosystem restoration. Yeah, that's definitely a good one. I love the way food for all and clean water is like right in the middle, right? Because it's going to be hard to have, well, I don't know. I mean, those are good debatable ones, right? Like, can we have clean water with the people we have on the planet without some more wizardly solutions, right? What are you seeing, Steve? Oh, it's interesting. Building dams is wizardly. Yeah. Yeah, this is exactly what we were looking for. So thanks, guys. Okay, so we just have a few more minutes. What do you guys think? What are you seeing? What's going through your mind when you're doing this activity as you try to place where these different potential interventions or solutions go on this spectrum?
I was thinking about how much are we trying to control things versus let them be the way they are.
Yeah, well, tell me more about that.
Well, the wizard side seemed like, as you guys were describing it, that seemed like the biggest shift between the two mentalities is how much do we believe that we can control things and should control things.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's actually a really good, could be the axis actually, right?
Yeah.
How much, that's another way of looking at it.
Let the earth heal itself.
Yeah, and would you call that, which would you call that, Donna? Prophetic or wizardly?
It'd be in the middle too, because you would have to do something to make that happen,
Right.
to enforce it.
Yeah.
Control.
Control. Yeah. Other thoughts?
There's this cause and effect, like from the more emotional side, you're trying to create like a more strategic side, like from one side to the other. So as you see on the axis, this like organic farming, recycling, nature, and then on the right at the end, you have like transformation and, building dams. So I feel, especially in the book, that you could see the change of from what's happening to what needs to happen. And that's kind of coming across here. By the way, I really like the analysis of the book. It was really, really well done. So good job, Steve and Marc. We should definitely put it up as a resource on our website.
We will. I actually plan also to send a link to the author, because I have been in touch with the author in the Twitterverse, and he actually replied. So he said he would try to make it, but unfortunately he couldn't make it this time. So maybe we'll have him come on like we did with parachuting cats into Borneo. Yeah, cool. What are you thinking, Steve?
Well, I'm curious. I know we have, I forget, I see Iris here, and I don't know if anybody else, and maybe Arn experiences the same thing. I see the different things that people are coming up with. I mean, I don't think technology is always a problem, but I see the issue of like not understanding the repercussions of our interventions and our innovations. I know in places like, I guess this isn't just about innovation and technical wizardry, but in Germany, isn't it true now that you have to, like if you sell something, you have to take back the packaging? I'm wondering if there's any country, I mean, there's this issue of the circular economy, right? Mm-hmm. That designing things so that they can be recycled. Yeah. And maybe that's one of the places that this is leading me, is like when we start creating things, do we have a sense of, what happens when they're no longer used, or what's their impact going to be in the long run? I mean,
that's a great one. Where would you put circular economy on the?
I'd put it in a way, it's kind of, in some ways it's the middle, it's a balance, right? Of
right.
You want to make sure things can be used, but you have to technically manipulate things so that the components they're using can either be used again or recycled or decayed or whatever.
Yeah. So we do have to close down the session. Remember, and for those that have, this is your first time, or if you haven't been here before, to a Wednesday web jam, we have another half an hour we call the backstage, where we'll stop the YouTube and we can just have a discussion for another half an hour. I think that's a great place to kind of transition, and then we can pick that up. There's also this concept of a petri dish, right? Which we didn't talk about. We'll talk about in the backstage, but that's how there's only a sustainable, there's a sustainable level of any organism inside of its system, and where do we get to the edge of the petri dish, and are we already there? So that's something that also we can talk about in the backstage. But what I'll do here is quickly, Steve, am I sharing my screen? No, I'm not sharing my screen.
I don't think so anymore, no.
Okay, very good. Let me see. Here we go. So without further ado, I will introduce our colleague, Heather, who will be here next week to talk about change management for innovation. Heather, what's that going to be about?
Well, we're going to share a couple of tools that you can use that are for change management, and we're going to apply it to innovation. So
awesome.
As a high level review.
Title, yeah, it's exactly,
exactly what it says. That's what we're going to do.
So that'll be a really good one. Looking forward to actually everything we do with innovation is about change, and how you manage that change or how you deal with that change is something that is very much should be in the toolkit of all of us who deal with innovation, change, and with design, right? So this is going to be a really interesting session next Wednesday. It will be next Wednesday, if I'm not mistaken, 1700 European time and 12 o'clock US Eastern Daylight Time. If you have an idea for a future topic, can one of my crew members please put the link in the chat if we have it? And if not, we'll drop it in there later in the backstage. Oh, there it is, bit.ly WWJ ideas. There you go. So if you want to, also if you want to follow us, please do so. And we have this little thing we call coffee. Oh, here's the crew. We're the ones that volunteer, and we do all of this just to maintain the community and learn from one another and fail forward. So hopefully today's session's been valuable to everybody. If you do have a minute and you're interested in buying us a cup of coffee for as little as $3, you can contribute to our fund that helps us keep this thing going. Nobody is getting rich. Nobody's getting paid. We're just using that to support our Zoom account and our Miro account and our Mural account and our MailChimp and all the rest of that kind of stuff. So there you go. We're excited to see you guys next week for Heather's session on change management for innovation. And Steve, thank you for your time. Thank you all for being here. Let's do a little wave. Goodbye, YouTube. And we'll stop the YouTube streaming. Let's see, how do we do that?